Okay, our next speaker is James Davies. So let me briefly introduce him. James Davies graduated at Warwick about 3 years ago, and then he moved to the University of Waterloo, where he do his PhD under the supervision of Jim Gielan. He has a couple of nice papers about χ-boundedness, and he promised to mention some of his results now. So please, James, the virtual stage is yours.
Thank you for the introduction. And thank you to organisers of all these seminars and the relay in general. The relay is a really nice idea, and it's one of those things that actually works a lot better on Zoom. It'd take a long time to get all the way around if we had to get on a flight between each talk. So today I'm talking about some colouring results for circle graphs and some of their generalisations, so more general classes that contain them. So I guess the first result that got me into this is this, which I proved with McCarty a few years ago now, so my first term at Waterloo. So put one way, what the theorem is that if you're given a chord diagram, so chords on a circle, and no omega plus one of them pairwise intersect, then you can actually partition these chords into at most 7 omega squared sets, so that in each of these sets, your chords in the set are pairwise disjoint. So you can rephrase this another way as a graph colouring result. So given a chord diagram, you can define a circle graph. So circle graphs are intersection graphs of chord diagrams, where vertices correspond to chords and two vertices are adjacent whenever their corresponding chords intersect. So, for example, in this circle graph, our vertices are of the same colour of their corresponding chords. And now, in the context of circle graphs, our theorem says that a circle graph with clique number at most omega has chromatic number at most 7 omega squared. And this improves on previous exponential bounds. And clique number is just the size of your largest complete graph, so largest set of pairwise adjacent vertices. Now, I want to show you a couple of theorems to motivate circle graphs. So more than just being a nice class of geometric intersection graphs, there's some really deep connections between circle graphs and other graph classes, such as planar graphs, and theory of vertex minors really illustrates that there's a lot going on with these graphs. So I introduced vertex minors, and perhaps being a little brave motivating circle graphs with vertex minors, because these are an unusual thing and normally it goes the other way around with circle graph motivating vertex minors, but I think there is a couple of really striking theorems for vertex minors that show that this graph class is important. So vertex minors is a minor-like relation. So we can look at two things that circle graphs are closed under. So the more obvious one is that we're closed under vertex deletion. So if we delete a vertex in our circle graph, this just corresponds to deleting a chord in a chord diagram. The less obvious one is that we're also closed under local complementation. This is a more weird operation of vertex minor. So the act of performing local complementation at a vertex is you look at the neighbourhood of your vertex. So on these 3 vertices here, and you could complement that induced subgraph. So here on these 3 vertices, we replace these 2 edges, non-edges, and add in this edge here. So the way you modify your chord diagram to do local complementation is, if we're complementing on this blue vertex again, we can look at an arc between the endpoints of our blue chord, and we can look at the endpoints of other chords that lie on the arc. So here in order, we have a gold endpoint purple, green, gold, red. And then all we have to do is reverse the order. So kind of flip this arc. So now we have red, gold, green, purple, gold. So it's reversed order. And this will do the local complementation in our intersection graph. And then you don't actually have to worry too much about this definition of vertex minor for the talk, but a graph's a vertex minor of another graph if you can obtain it by a sequence of vertex deletions and local complementations. So here's one theorem for vertex minors in circle graphs, which I think shows their importance here, which is if you forbid a circle graph as a vertex minor, then you have bounded rank width, where rank width's another width parameter, like tree width, but more for vertex minors. So of course, this theorem looks almost exactly like the classic grid theorem for minors. So if you forbid a planar graph as a minor, then you have bounded tree width. And again, this is exact just like for planar graphs, because circle graphs can have unbounded rank width. So this theorem really shows that, like planar graphs are for minors, circle graphs are a really fundamental class of graphs for vertex minors, and should play a similar role for vertex minors. So another nice theorem, similar to another theorem on planar graphs, is a Krawczyk-like theorem for vertex minors. So Krawczyk's theorem says that your planar graph, if and only if you don't contain any of these two given graphs are minors. And this version for circle graphs says your circle graph, if you don't contain any of these three wheel-like graphs as a vertex minor. So something I think is really interesting about these two theorems is that you can actually use this theorem on circle graph vertex minors to prove Krawczyk's theorem. It certainly wouldn't be the easiest proof of Krawczyk's theorem, but you can do it, and I think that's a good way of illustrating that there is this deep connection between circle graphs and planar graphs. Okay, so hopefully everyone agrees that we care about coloring planar graphs, so coloring circle graphs would also be interesting. So one thing with circle graphs is that they have unbounded chromatic number, and this is because if you have a set of pairwise intersecting chords, then they form a clique, and a clique provides a lower bound for a chromatic number because you need to color all the vertices differently. But it's still interesting to ask what happens if we forbid a clique or forbid some complete graph, because in general, this isn't enough to bound a chromatic number. So classically, Tuts showed that there's triangle-free graphs with arbitrarily large chromatic number. And actually, this is something that can get a lot worse. So there's graphs with arbitrarily large girth and chromatic number, where girth's the length of your sort of cycle in your graph. So although you can't do it for the class of all graphs, we've already seen that circle graphs is one example where you can get this upper bound in terms of a clique number with this 7 omega squared bound. Another example where you can do this, which is perhaps a more familiar example, just stated slightly differently, is Weising's theorem on edge coloring line graphs. So put another way, it says that a line graph with clique number omega can be colored with at most omega plus 1 colors. So to formally define this idea, we'll say that a class is chi-bounded if there exists this function, which provides an upper bound for the chromatic number in terms of a clique number. Now, I'd like to mention a couple more classic results on chi-boundedness, one positive and one negative, with a focus on geometric intersection graphs. So one positive one is that rectangle intersection graphs are chi-bounded. So now these are intersection graphs of axis-aligned rectangles in the plane. And like how in circle graphs, our vertices corresponded to chords. Now our vertices correspond to rectangles, and two vertices are adjacent if the corresponding rectangles intersect. Now you can take this class a step further and go to higher dimensions. So free space, for example. Now we're looking at box intersection graphs, axis-aligned boxes in free space. And another classic result from Berling is that there's triangle-free box intersection graphs with arbitrarily large chromatic number. Okay, so getting back to circle graphs, I mentioned that there were older results proving chi-boundedness with just larger chi-bounding functions. So this is another classic result that circle graphs are chi-bounded. And while vertex minors are somewhat fresh in our minds still, I mentioned that Jim Geelin conjectured a much more general statement that any proper vertex minor closed class of graphs is chi-bounded. So this is a much more general statement because, like how we saw circle graphs forbid these small wheels as vertex minors, instead of forbidding a small wheel, you can give me any large complicated graph you want. And if you forbid that as a vertex minor, then this conjecture says that you're chi-bounded. So beyond circle graphs, another natural class this was proved for is graphs with bounded rank width. These are chi-bounded. And by going through the grid theorem we saw earlier, and using this rank width theorem, you can show that if you forbid a circle graph as a vertex minor, then you're chi-bounded. And then just last year, I was able to prove this conjecture in general. So if you forbid any given graph as a vertex minor, then you're chi-bounded. So I won't talk about the proof of this result at all today, but I would like to show you the idea behind proving circle graphs are chi-bounded. So I'll start with the more classical proof where you get these exponential bounds, because this uses a technique that's very commonly applied to prove chi-boundedness theorems. So the idea is that in a graph with huge chromatic number, we can take a leveling. So what I mean is we can take a vertex in our graph and first look at its neighborhood. And we can keep going and look at the vertices of distance 2 and keep going distance t. So the nice thing in doing this is that we can find some vertices of distance some t that induce a subgraph with at least half chromatic number of our original graph. So the reason we can do this or find a level with at least half chromatic number is because we could always alternate what colors we use on each level, like so. And if every level needed less than half chromatic number colors, then we're using too few colors. So we can always find this level with at least half chromatic number. It just might be for vertices of some distance t where t is large. And then the nice thing is that this is something you can now repeat. So in this induced subgraph with half chromatic number, we can take another leveling and get down to something that now has quarter chromatic number. And you can do this as many times as you want. So this ends up giving you a rather nice structure. So you get something that looks like this. Here, for each of these purple sets, the vertices in these purple sets have a parent in these red sets above them, and these red sets are connected. And in this blue set, which is the set of vertices where we've been halving the chromatic number each time, whenever we take a vertex in our blue set, we can find a parent vertex it's adjacent to in each of these purple sets. And there could then be some extra edges between these purple sets and other red sets, but this isn't something we need to worry about today. So this is the technique originally used to prove that circle graphs are chi-bounded. The one unfortunate thing about this technique is that each time you do a Löffling, this halves a chromatic number. So this is what leads to these 2 to the omega terms you often see in chi-bounding functions. Because in general, to find larger and larger cliques, you will likely have to do more and more Löffels. So when you see these 2 to the omega terms, this is usually where it comes from. So how to actually apply this for circle graphs? We can again, what we want to do is again take a repeated Löffling and get this nice structure. So we can look at one chord and take this Löffling. So now the chords in this blue set will have at least half chromatic number. And each chord in this blue set has a purple parent. So there'll be some purple chord intersecting it and with its other end in this red set. So this would be looking a lot like this structure here for only having one of these Löfflings. And again, just to reiterate once more, the important structure we have here is that if we take a chord down here in our blue set, we can find some purple chord intersecting it with its other endpoint in the red set. Okay, so we repeat this process taking multiple Löfflings, and we can get something like this. And now say in this blue set, we can find a few chords on disjoint arcs. So like this. Then this is going to actually force a large clique at this point. So in order, we can look at each chord, starting with this one. And this again has this purple parent, so a purple chord intersecting it with an endpoint in each of these red sets. We do the same for the second and the same for the third. And then this can give us our clique, where we just have these purple chords going between a red set and its opposite black chord. So there's some technicalities to worry about here, but this is one way to prove that circle graphs are chi-bounded. So I mentioned that we're able to improve this bound to a polynomial one. So we proved the 7 omega squared bound. So after having polynomial, the next natural question would be, how good can you make this chi-bounding function? And you might hope that you might have something close to Weising's theorem, so say at least linear. But this turns out to not be the case. So you can get a superlinear lower bound. So in particular, you can find circle graphs with chromatic number about a half times omega log omega. So one result I'm happy to be able to talk a bit about today is that I've been able to improve this quadratic bound and get very close to its lower bound, so within a small constant factor. So I can prove that circle graphs with clique number omega have chromatic number at most about just over 2 times omega log omega, where this time our logs in base 2. So I want to give a very sketchy sketch of how you prove these quadratic and this omega log omega bound. So there's going to be some missing details, but hopefully there'll be enough here so that you can see what style of argument this is and also how the clique number comes into play. So essentially what our proof in both these cases are is we're doing an inductive proof. And it's one of these inductive proofs where instead of aiming to prove our theorem with the exact bounds we want, we instead prove a stronger theorem on extending some kind of well-structured existing pre-coloring. And the reason for doing this is that this better facilitates these kind of inductive arguments. So perhaps the best example illustrating this kind of thing is Thomason's proof that planar graphs are 5-choosable. Okay, so what I'll talk about maybe more closely resembles the quadratic bound, but I'll also mention some differences that come up with the omega log omega. So one important feature for precoloring we want to extend is that we can partition our circle into some arcs, and then all the pre-colored chords are going to be chords with endpoints in different arcs. The second important feature or structural property of our pre-coloring is that if we're just looking at extending within one of these arcs, so say it's black one, and we look at a chord with just one endpoint on this black arc, then we want to be able to tell something about its other endpoint by its color. So for example, here, if we look at its color and it's blue, then this is going to tell us where the other endpoint lies. So it tells us that the other endpoint lies on this blue arc. So one feature in the quadratic bound proof is that what we end up doing is that all the chords going between two given arcs, we color the same. So we do improper coloring first, and then after doing this, we go back through and refine our improper coloring, giving us a quadratic bound. So this, in a sense, presents some kind of inefficiency by going through this improper coloring first. So one part of the omega log omega proof is that we're instead going through and doing proper coloring as we go. So there can be multiple different shades of blue colored chords, I guess. This introduces some difficulties that are hard to deal with, because we can end up getting lots of chords of different colors coming from one arc without any of them pairwise intersecting, which is a bad thing for preserving so many colors. So that's something that gets harder to deal with, and something I'll mention a little bit about how you deal about what I'll mention a little bit about what you have to do for that. Okay, but returning to this this proof, we have this nice property of knowing where other endpoints of chords are when we're looking to extend. So we can just split our arcs up into the ones that are important here, and we're looking at extending into this black arc again. So what we want to do from here is start splitting our black arc up into some smaller ones, where we want each of these smaller ones to be easier to deal with. So we'll forget about the rest of this arc for now, and let's concentrate on this smaller black arc we split off from it. So the idea is that we want to say that we've lost some colors from these arcs in the pre-coloring. So we can look at the chords with one endpoint, so the chords that are pre-colored on this arc, and look at their colors, and that tells us where the other endpoints are. So we choose this first arc that we break off so that we actually lose some of the colors from this pre-coloring. So for example, here we only have colors from 3 of these arcs. So for the purpose of extending in this black arc here, that means we can forget about this purple and this gold arc. Now there'll be more to deal with here, because we haven't considered chords going between this arc we've cut off and the rest of this arc. But this gives us some hope, because we've managed to save some colors from the pre-coloring here. So when we go through and add some colors later, this gives us some room for adding some new colors to chords with an endpoint in here and here. Okay, so we continue this process of chopping up our arc into smaller, simpler ones. And say for each one, we're going to do it so that there's only chords of 3 different colors from these pre-existing arcs. So for this next one, we wouldn't have to worry about blue or pink. And we keep doing this until this process ends. And now for each of these sub-arcs we split into, they only have colored chords from 3 of these arcs from a pre-coloring. Now, the next thing we'd have to worry about at this point is the chords that go between these sub-arcs we've created. So we want to be able to color this in such a way that within any one of these arcs, we don't add too many colors. So we'd hope that this shouldn't be too hard. One thing that we should be concerned about is that this might not necessarily be any easier of a problem than coloring circle graphs in general. So for example, if we had lots and lots of these sub-arcs we had split into, then the graph we're now looking to color here could be just as complicated rather than any circle graph. So we could have any circle graph from the chords between these arcs if we had enough of these arcs. So really the only hope we have for coloring these chords to be any easier than coloring circle graphs in general is that we only had to split our arc up into a bounded number of smaller arcs. So this is where clique number comes in and where we aim to apply a Turan-like result. So actually keeping some of the colors from the arcs of the pre-coloring comes in handy here, because we know we have these chords that have an endpoint in each of these arcs, 3 in each, say. So we can just redraw our thing like this. And because we have a lot of chords going to these different arcs in each of these, what we'd expect is that this should somehow create a large clique, right? So here we use a Turan-like result. So what this Turan-like result says is that there's a bound, if you bound the clique number, so bound the number of pairwise intersecting chords, so there's no omega plus 1 pairwise intersecting chords, then you should have only this finite number of pairs of arcs, ones from the arcs from the one we split up and arcs from their pre-coloring, where there's a chord between the two. And each of these is in at least 3 of these pairs, because we've chosen them to have 3 of these colors. So what we'd end up getting in this case is something like this. And by design, we're going to have lots of these chords between lots of different pairs. And by applying a Turan-like lemma, we can so that this means there's a clique in here somewhere. So in this case, we find these 4 pairwise intersecting chords. So this is an important step in the proof, and this is actually one of the bits that get harder when you go and try and do the omega or log omega bound, or in another extension we have. So this lemma for this chords between different arcs, I think is a very natural one. For these harder bounds of omega log omega and another result, we actually end up using very specialized Turan-type lemmas, which are beyond just being for these geometric intersection graphs, they're also very much designed for the structure of the coloring we give them and the coloring we extend. Okay, so having done this, this gives us a bound on the number of arcs we need to split up into. And each of these don't have too many colors going in, and we need to color these chords next. So these aren't too bad to color now that we've got this bound on the number of arcs. So we can do that. And now the hope is that we do this in such a way that in each of these individual arcs we can now extend. So let's just look at this arc. So we can look at the colored chords coming into it. We have these ones from a pre-coloring. In particular, we only have 3 out of the 5, lost to a purple and gold color. And we have these newly colored chords. So because we lost 2, we can allow an extra 2 new colors here. And then this will be structured in a nice enough way that this satisfies our pre-coloring requirement, and we're now some smaller graph with this extending our coloring into on this segment. So by the inductive argument, we can extend in here. So in particular, we end up getting something that looks like this. And this is what matters for our extension in this black subarc, which is smaller than before. And if we did this for any other arc, it's exactly the same thing. So it'll be the same for this arc as well, and all the others. So with this new omega log omega bound, the next natural question is what the leading constants would be. So what the asymptotically optimal bounds would be. So actually here we can improve the lower bound a little bit. So we can remove this half factor. And here's one of the small examples displaying this lower bound. And I think it's a nice looking chord diagram. It almost looks very much like a circling graph. And one feature is that these sort of chords towards the outside of a circle, these are drawn thicker, which is just going to mean that we actually add multiple chords coinciding on top of each other. And then the way to prove this, has omega log omega chromatic number is relatively simple. We just need to bound the clique number, and we bound the size of the largest independent set, so size of the largest set of pairwise disjoint chords. Okay, but getting back to generalizations of circle graphs now. Oh, sorry. So for this problem with the asymptotically optimal chi-bounding function, I think there's kind of 4 natural candidates for this could be with these new bounds. And that kind of splits the problem up into 2 natural subproblems. So the first is, can you get rid of this factor of 2 and replace this with a 1 here? And the second is, can you replace this base 2 log with natural log? So progress on either of those 2, I think, would be interesting. Okay, so another way to generalize circle graphs. One obvious way to generalize intersection graphs of chords in a circle is just to forget about the circle. So we can forget about the circle and now just look at intersection graphs of segments in the plane. Now, actually for chi-boundedness, this has already gone too far. So we know that there's triangle-free intersection graphs of segments in the plane with as large chromatic number as you want. But it's not hopeless for these graphs still, because if you have girth at least 5, then you have bounded chromatic number. So you still don't have this disaster where you can have large girth and chromatic number. And now we can also take this a step further. So instead of looking at segments in the plane, we can go and look at segments in free space. And actually, here you don't have this nice girth 5 result anymore. And actually, you can have segments in free space. This intersection graph is after your large girth and chromatic number. And actually, this result's more general, so you can replace segments with full lines in free space as well. And another result I'd like to mention, and this one's maybe cheating a bit because they don't contain circle graphs, but these same techniques can be applied to intersection graphs of boxes in free space. So generalizing Berling's result, boxes in free space, their intersection graphs can have large girth and chromatic number. So I won't talk too much about the proof of these two results, but the nice thing about them is that they're actually proved by an application of a sparse multi-dimensional version of the classical van der Waals theorem. So van der Waals theorem is the theorem that says that if you finitely color the integers, then you can find arbitrarily long monochromatic arithmetic progressions. So I think this is a nice connection between two seemingly very different coloring results. So we saw for chi-boundedness that going all the way to segment intersection graphs was too far. We're not chi-bounded then. So let's look at some other generalizations that don't go quite as far. So one nice generalization of circle graphs is polygon circle graphs. So now instead of just looking at chords on your circle, we're looking at polygons inscribed on the circle. And here's one polygon circle graph, the 5-wheel, which is a circle graph as we saw earlier from the forbidden vertex minus. And it's known polygon circle graphs are chi-bounded. And actually, these are also polynomially chi-bounded. So problem of polynomial chi-boundedness can be reduced to circle graphs in this case. It can be shown that if you have a chi-bounding function for circle graphs and you multiply it by omega plus 1 choose 2, then you have a new chi-bounding function for polygon circle graphs. Actually, our original omega squared proof for circle graphs can also be adapted without too much trouble to work for polygon circle graphs. An interesting thing with the omega log omega proof is that this completely breaks down and doesn't seem to work for polygon circle graphs. So we still have the same lower bound for these, and so this gap for polygon circle graphs still remains. Generalizing circle graphs in a slightly different direction is grounded L graphs. So these are intersection graphs of grounded L states, by which I mean L states whose topmost point lie on some grounding line. And it might not be obvious, but these actually contain circle graphs as well. And these are also known to be chi-bounded, with the best known chi-bounding function being doubly exponential. So we're also able to extend the circle graph proof to these grounded L states. So we proved that these are also polynomially chi-bounded, this time with a polynomial of degree 4. And this results joint work with Tomasz Krawczyk, McCarty, and Bartosz Walczak. Now, seeing this extension, it's tempting to ask how far you can take these ideas. So a next step is perhaps grounded segment graphs. So these are intersection graphs of segments where you have an endpoint lying on some grounding line. And these are also known to be chi-bounded. So we conjectured that these should also be polynomially chi-bounded. And actually, you could ask the same question for an even more general class. So in terms of grounded intersection graphs, the most general would be outer strings are also chi-bounded. So these are intersection graphs or just general curves that have an endpoint on some grounding line. But I feel like this is something you really want to take one step at a time. So already going from circle graphs to grounded L graphs, there's some difficulties introduced, and this requires some new ideas to resolve. So I think going straight to outer strings perhaps too much, and you want to go slightly more general each time and see what new difficulties arise and what new ideas are introduced when you hopefully resolve them. But I do hope that eventually one day someone will be able to extend this all the way to outer string. Okay, I'll stop there. Thanks for listening.
Thanks for the talk, James. Are there any questions? If so, please unmute yourself and ask.
Can I ask for these last few classes, are there any lower bounds?
Yeah, so for up to grounded segments, still the best known lower bounds, omega log omega. For outer string, you can do better and get omega plus 1 choose 2. So you can get a quadratic lower bound for outer string.
And you believe it's all polynomial?
Yeah, I think it'll be polynomial. At least up to outer string. I think it'd be very hard, but I think it should be.
Thank you again for the talk. And I will hand over to Oxford. We have a break of roughly 20 minutes until the next talk starts.